Hey friends, tonight we open a window to a time not many dare revisit. The streets are too quiet, the air smells like vinegar and something worse, and the bell, yes, the bell, just rang again. That means another body. Tonight you're not a doctor, you're not a noble, you're just a person, alive, for now. So, if these candlelit walks through uncomfortable corners of the past help you drift off, tap the like button and subscribe if you feel called. And let me know what time it is for you and where you're listening from. Now, pull the blanket closer. The fire's gone out, and the year is 1348. The morning arrives without ceremony. You wake on a straw mattress that rustles with every movement, the fibers poking through the thin cloth covering. Your small room sits above a baker's shop, and normally you'd smell bread rising, yeast mingling with warmth. But the baker hasn't opened his shutters in 3 days. The silence below feels heavy, unnatural. You dress slowly in the dim light filtering through a single small window. The glass is thick and warped, casting strange shadows on the wooden floor. Your clothes are simple, a rough woolen tunic, linen undergarments that scratch against your skin, and leather shoes that have been resoled more times than you can remember. Everything smells faintly of smoke from the fires that burn constantly now, carrying away what the living hope will protect them. The water in your washing bowl has grown stale overnight. You splash it on your face anyway, the coolness a small comfort. In the polished metal that serves as your mirror, your reflection looks tired. Everyone looks tired these days. Sleep comes fitfully when it comes at all, interrupted by sounds from the street, carts rolling over cobblestones, voices calling out in languages of grief you're learning to understand. Your breakfast consists of hard bread and small beer, the grain somewhat stale but still filling. The bread cracks between your teeth, and you chew slowly, savoring each bite. Food is becoming scarce. The farmers who once brought fresh goods to market are gone, fled to the countryside, or simply gone. The merchants who imported spices and preserved meats have shuttered their shops, their warehouses standing empty with doors nailed shut. You step outside into air that feels thick, almost viscous. The smell hits you immediately, a mixture of vinegar, herbs, and underneath it all something sweeter and more disturbing. The authorities have ordered that all refuse be removed from the streets, but their orders carry less weight now. Fewer people remain to follow them, and those who do are focused on their own survival. The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick in places where merchants once threw out wash water. Now the stones are dry, scattered with dried herbs that people drop, hoping to purify the air around them. Rosemary, thyme, and lavender crunch under your shoes, releasing their oils in small bursts of fragrance that quickly fade back into the heavier atmosphere. Your neighbor's house stands with its shutters closed and a red cross painted hastily on the door. The paint is still wet enough to reflect the weak morning light. You know what it means. Someone inside is sick, or was sick. The house will remain sealed for 40 days, the traditional period of quarantine. Whether anyone inside survives that long is a question no one asks aloud. At the market square, perhaps a dozen stalls remain open where once there were 50. The remaining merchants stand behind their goods, looking anxious, eager to complete their business and return home. They wrap cloth around their faces, and many hold small bundles of herbs to their noses, breathing in the oils as they speak to customers. The conversation is brief, practical, punctuated by long silences. The bread seller's hands shake slightly as she measures out your portion. Her prices have doubled, then tripled, but you pay without argument. Arguments take energy, and energy is something you need to conserve. She wraps the bread in clean cloth and places it carefully in your basket, avoiding any contact with your hands. Trust is a luxury no one can afford. You notice the absence of children in the streets. Parents keep them inside now, away from the air that seems to carry invisible dangers. The few children you do see move differently, quietly, staying close to walls, avoiding the center of streets where people once gathered to talk and laugh. Their games are played in whispers, if they play at all. The church bells ring throughout the day, but not for prayers or celebrations. Each toll marks another soul departed, another family grieving in the isolation of their shuttered homes. The bell ringer himself is an old man who moves slowly up the stone steps to the tower, his breathing labored, but his duty unwavering. He knows that these bells provide one of the few remaining threads connecting the community. Inside the church, the air is heavy with incense burned continuously now. The priest stands before a congregation that grows smaller each week, his voice echoing in the vast space. The wooden pews, once packed with families, now hold scattered individuals who sit far apart from one another. They kneel and pray with an intensity that comes from genuine fear, their whispered words rising to the vaulted ceiling like smoke. The priest himself looks thinner than he did a month ago. His robes hang loose on his frame, and his hands tremble slightly as he lifts the communion cup. He continues to offer the sacraments, but many decline to drink from the shared cup. Faith and survival make uneasy companions, and practical concerns often win. Your daily work continues, but with modifications that would have seemed strange just months ago. If you're a craftsman, you work alone in your shop, handling goods with cloths wrapped around your hands. If you're a merchant, you conduct business from a distance, money changing hands across extended counters. If you're a servant, you move through houses that feel more like tombs, tidying rooms that no one enters. The physicians, those few who remain, wear strange costumes that make them look like large, dark birds. Their leather masks have long beaks, stuffed with herbs and aromatic substances, designed to filter the air they breathe. Their dark robes are waxed to repel whatever invisible forces they believe caused the sickness. They move through the streets like harbingers, their presence both reassuring and terrifying. When they visit the sick, they carry long wooden sticks to examine patients without touching them directly. They feel for fever through the length of the stick, observe symptoms from a careful distance, and offer treatments that range from bloodletting to herbal concoctions. Their success rate is difficult to measure because so few patients recover, regardless of treatment. The apothecary's shop still operates, but its shelves grow barer each day. Dried herbs that were once common now command extraordinary prices. Garlic, believed to purify blood, sells for the cost of a week's wages. Theriac, a complex mixture of dozens of ingredients, including ground viper's flesh, is available only to the wealthy. Most people make do with whatever herbs they can find or afford. Your own preventive measures follow the common wisdom of the time. You avoid crowds, though crowds are increasingly rare anyway. You burn aromatic woods in your fireplace, filling your room with smoke believed to cleanse the air. You wear a small pouch of herbs around your neck, the leather cord rubbing against your skin throughout the day. Whether these measures help is impossible to know, but they provide a sense of control in circumstances that feel utterly beyond control. The night hours bring their own challenges. Sleep comes in fragments, interrupted by sounds from the street, carts collecting the dead, voices calling out for help, or sometimes just the wind moving through empty buildings. You lie on your straw mattress listening to these sounds, your mind turning over the events of the day, calculating your chances, planning for tomorrow while wondering if tomorrow will come. In your dreams, when dreams come, you often see familiar faces, neighbors who disappeared, merchants who no longer open their shops, children who once played in the streets. These dream faces look healthy and happy, as they did before the world changed. You wake from these dreams feeling both comforted and deeply sad, the contrast between dream and reality particularly sharp in the gray light of dawn. The seasons continue their cycle, indifferent to human suffering. Spring arrives with its usual promise of renewal, but the gardens that should be planted remain untended. Summer brings heat that makes the air even more oppressive, the smells more concentrated. Autumn offers harvest time, but there are fewer hands to gather what crops have grown wild. Winter provides its own mercy. The cold air feels cleaner. The sounds of sickness seem muffled by snow. Throughout it all, you persist. You wake each morning. You eat what food you can find. You go about your daily routine with modifications that have become second nature. You avoid crowds, maintain distance from others, and hope that whatever invisible force is taking your neighbors will pass over your door. You do this not because you're brave, but because the alternative is surrender, and surrender feels like a luxury you can't afford. Your life has become smaller, more focused on basic needs and immediate survival. The concerns that once occupied your mind, social standings, future plans, material ambitions, have faded into irrelevance. What matters now is simple. Another day lived, another night survived, another morning's chance to continue. And so you continue, one careful step at a time, through a world that has become unrecognizable, holding on to routines and rituals that provide structure in chaos. You are both witness to and participant in one of history's great catastrophes, living through it with quiet determination and the hope that somewhere ahead the world will remember how to be normal again. The bells continue to ring, marking time and loss, but also marking your persistence. Each toll that finds you still listening is a small victory, a proof of survival that needs no other validation than your continued breath in the strange, heavy air of this transformed world. Sleep comes finally, not from peace, but from exhaustion, and in sleep, for a few hours, the world is as it was before everything changed, and that, perhaps, is enough. Why You Wouldn't Survive the Plague, Chapter 1. The first cough. Close your eyes and imagine yourself settling into the familiar rhythms of medieval life. The year could be 1347, or perhaps 1665, or even earlier still, when the world moved at the pace of footsteps and the turning of seasons. Your days begin before dawn, with the gentle stirring of embers in the hearth, the soft shuffle of straw beneath your feet, and the quiet murmur of your family beginning another day, much like all the others that came before. In this world, sounds carry differently than they do in our modern time. There are no engines humming in the distance, no electrical buzz underlying every moment. Instead, there is the gentle lowing of cattle in nearby fields, the soft whisper of wind through thatched roofs, and the rhythmic thump of grain being ground by hand or by the turning of a great stone wheel powered by flowing water. Your ears have grown accustomed to these gentle organic sounds, and so when something new enters this familiar symphony, you notice it immediately. It begins as the faintest disturbance in the morning quiet from the house next to yours, separated perhaps by only a thin wall of wattle and daub, or maybe across a narrow lane where the buildings lean so close together that neighbors can almost touch hands from their upper windows, comes a sound that makes you pause in your morning routine. At first, it might be nothing more than the soft clearing of a throat, the kind of gentle sound that anyone might make upon waking. You continue with your tasks, perhaps kneading dough for the day's bread, or feeding scraps to the chickens that peck and cluck in your small yard. But then the sound comes again, and this time it carries a different quality. It is deeper, more persistent, and followed by a moment of quiet that seems to stretch longer than it should. You find yourself listening now, your hands still busy with their work, but your attention drawn to that thin wall or narrow space that separates your life from your neighbors. In a world where privacy is a luxury few can afford, where families often sleep together in single rooms and neighbors know each other's daily rhythms as well as their own, the sounds of illness become as familiar as the sounds of health. Your neighbor, let us call him Thomas, has lived next to you for many years. You know the sound of his morning routine as well as you know your own, the creak of his wooden bed frame, the shuffle of his feet across the floor, the gentle murmur of his voice as he greets his wife and children. But this morning something is different. The cough comes again, followed by a soft wheeze that seems to catch in his throat. It is not the sharp, clear cough of someone trying to dislodge a bit of bread or dust. This is something that seems to come from deeper within, something that speaks of discomfort settling into his chest. In your time before the age of modern medicine, every cough carries weight. There is no quick trip to a pharmacy, no antibiotics waiting on a shelf, no understanding of germs or viruses, or the invisible world of microorganisms that dance through the air you breathe. Instead, there is only the wisdom passed down through generations, the careful watching for signs and symptoms, and the growing dread that accompanies certain familiar patterns of illness. You remember other times when such sounds have drifted through your community. Perhaps it was 2 summers ago, when old Margaret from 3 houses down began with just such a cough. It started gently, almost apologetically, but within days it had grown into something that shook her entire frame. The women of the neighborhood brought her broths and herbal remedies, but the cough persisted, joined soon by fever and a peculiar smell that seemed to cling to her dwelling. Margaret recovered, eventually, though she was never quite the same afterward, and the memory of those weeks lingers in everyone's mind like a shadow that never quite disappears. Or perhaps you recall the winter when your own child developed a similar sound, and how you spent sleepless nights, listening to each breath, each cough, praying to whatever saints you could remember, and bargaining with fate for just one more sunrise, with your little one's eyes opening healthy and bright. That crisis passed as well, leaving you grateful but also newly aware of how fragile the boundary is between the sounds of normal life and the sounds that signal something far more serious approaching. Now, as Thomas's cough echoes again through the morning air, you feel that familiar tightness in your chest that has nothing to do with your own physical health. In your world, illness is not an individual matter. It spreads through families, through neighborhoods, through entire communities with a speed and thoroughness that can transform a thriving settlement into a place of empty houses and overgrown gardens in the span of a single season. The wheeze that follows his cough is soft but persistent, like the sound of air being drawn through a cloth or a narrow opening. You have heard this sound before, and the memory of it makes you move more quietly, as if by being very still you might avoid drawing the attention of whatever force has begun to visit your neighbor. In your time, illness is often understood as something that moves with intention, seeking new homes, new victims, drawn perhaps by loud voices or sudden movements, or the simple fact of being noticed. You pause in your work and listen more carefully. There is a rhythm to Thomas's distress now, a pattern of coughing followed by that soft wheeze, then a period of quiet that might be rest or might be something else entirely. His wife Mary can be heard moving about with her usual morning tasks, but there is something different in the quality of her movements as well. Where usually there might be the gentle hum of a woman comfortable in her routine, now there is a more purposeful quality, the sound of someone paying closer attention, listening with the same careful ears that you are using now. In your community, everyone has learned to read these subtle signs, a change in someone's morning routine, a different quality to their voice when they call out a greeting, the absence of familiar sounds that usually mark the progress of each day. These are the early warning signals that have kept your neighborhood aware of threats, both seen and unseen, for generations beyond counting. The cough comes again, and this time it is followed by what sounds like a brief conversation between Thomas and Mary. Their voices are too low to make out individual words, but the tone carries clearly through the thin walls. There is concern there, though they are both trying to keep it quiet. Mary's voice has the gentle, soothing quality of a woman trying to comfort someone she loves, while Thomas's responses are brief and somewhat breathless, as if speaking requires more effort than it should. You find yourself thinking about the past few days, searching your memory for any signs you might have missed. Was Thomas moving more slowly when you saw him working in his small garden? Did he seem tired when he nodded a greeting as you passed each other in the lane? In your world, these small observations can mean the difference between recognizing a threat early and finding yourself unprepared for what might come next. The truth is that Thomas has seemed perfectly well until this very morning. Just yesterday evening, you heard him laughing with his oldest son as they worked together to repair a section of their roof that had been damaged in a recent storm. The sound of their voices, mixing work with easy conversation, had been one of those pleasant background sounds that makes a neighborhood feel safe and familiar. There had been nothing in that laughter to suggest that by the next sunrise everything would begin to change. But this is how it always begins, isn't it? Not with drama or obvious signs, but with the smallest possible disturbance in the normal pattern of things. A single cough that might mean nothing or might mean everything. A wheeze that could be the result of a cold night, or the first sign of something that will reshape not just Thomas's life, but the lives of everyone around him. You remember the stories that travelers sometimes bring to your community, tales from other towns, other regions, where illness has moved through populations like wildfire, through dry grass. These stories always begin the same way, with someone who seemed perfectly healthy one day and slightly unwell the next, with a cough that started softly and grew stronger, with neighbors who noticed the change and hoped it was nothing more than a passing discomfort. In some of these stories, that hope proved justified. The illness passed, life returned to normal, and the whole episode became just another reminder of how precious health truly is. But in other stories, that first cough was indeed the beginning of something far more serious, something that spread from house to house, family to family, until entire communities were transformed by loss and grief, and the kind of fear that changes how people look at each other even after the immediate danger has passed. As you listen to Thomas's cough settling into a pattern, you realize that you are now part of one of these stories. You do not yet know which kind it will be, but you know that this moment, this morning when you first heard that soft wheeze and deeper cough, will be remembered later as either the day when Thomas had a brief cold or the day when everything changed. The weight of this uncertainty settles around you like a familiar but unwelcome garment. In your time before modern medicine and scientific understanding, every illness carries the same potential for transformation. A fever might break in 3 days, or it might linger for weeks. A cough might clear with rest and warm broths, or it might deepen and spread and become something that the entire community will remember for years to come. You think about your own family, sleeping peacefully in the room behind you, your spouse still breathing the slow, deep breaths of comfortable sleep, your children curled together for warmth, their small faces relaxed and trusting in the safety that you work so hard to provide. In a few hours, they will wake to a world that looks exactly the same as the one that existed yesterday. The same narrow lanes, the same familiar houses, the same neighbors going about their daily routines. But you know something now that they do not yet know. You have heard the first cough, noticed the first change in the familiar symphony of your community's daily life. You are now carrying a small seed of concern that will color every interaction, every decision, every moment of the days to come, regardless of whether Thomas's illness proves to be serious or passes quickly into memory. This is the burden of being awake to the subtle signs that surround you. Once you have heard that cough, notice that wheeze, recognize the different quality in Mary's movements. As she tends to her husband, you cannot unknow these things. They become part of your awareness, part of the careful attention you must pay to the world around you if you hope to protect yourself and those you love from whatever threats might be approaching. The morning light is growing stronger now, filtering through the small windows of your home and beginning to warm the air that felt so chill when you first rose from your bed. Soon, the full business of the day will begin. There will be bread to bake, animals to tend, work to be done in fields or workshops, or wherever your particular skills are needed in the complex web of cooperation that keeps your community functioning. But first, there will be this period of careful listening, of quiet observation, of trying to determine whether Thomas's cough is something that will pass or something that will grow. You know that Mary is doing the same thing in her house, listening to her husband's breathing, watching for signs that might tell her whether to prepare simple remedies or to begin making the kind of preparations that families make when they fear they are facing something more serious than a common cold. In the distance, you can hear the first sounds of other neighbors beginning their days, the creak of doors opening, the splash of water being poured, the soft voices of people greeting the morning and each other. Your community is waking up around you, and most of them have not yet heard what you have heard. They do not yet know that the comfortable predictability of yesterday has been touched by something new, something that might prove to be nothing, or might prove to be the beginning of a story that will test every resource, every tradition, every bond of mutual support that holds your small world together. As Thomas's cough echoes once more through the morning air, softer now but still carrying that distinctive wheeze, you realize that you are no longer simply starting another day. You are entering a period of watchful waiting, of careful attention, of the kind of quiet vigilance that your ancestors have practiced for countless generations. When faced with the first signs that something in their carefully ordered world might be about to change, the sun continues to rise, indifferent to human concerns, painting the familiar landscape in shades of gold and amber that speak of continuity in the endless cycle of days and seasons that has sustained your community for as long as anyone can remember. But underneath that eternal rhythm, you can now hear something new, something that began with nothing more than a neighbor's cough, but which has already started to reshape how you listen to the world around you, how you think about the safety of those you love, and how you prepare for whatever the coming days might bring. Why You Wouldn't Survive the Plague, Chapter 2. The Arrival. Let yourself drift back to a time when the world was vast and mysterious, when journeys across water took months rather than hours, and when news traveled at the speed of footsteps and hoofbeats. Picture yourself in a coastal town, perhaps nestled against a natural harbor where the water meets the land in gentle curves, protected from the worst storms by rocky outcroppings that have stood sentinel for countless generations. This is your world, bounded by familiar horizons and shaped by the rhythm of tides that have marked time since long before your great-grandmother's grandmother first walked these same streets. Your community thrives on the delicate balance between land and sea. The fishermen rise before dawn to cast their nets in waters that provide both sustenance and livelihood, while merchants and craftspeople create the goods that will be traded with the occasional ships that arrive bearing cargo from distant places with names that sound like poetry or prayers. These arrivals are always events of great interest, bringing not just exotic goods, but stories of far-off lands, news of wars and treaties, and sometimes new faces that will become part of your community's ever-evolving tapestry. But on this particular morning, as you go about your usual routines, you have no way of knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, a ship is approaching that will change everything. The vessel moves slowly across waters that stretch endlessly in all directions, its wooden hull cutting through waves that have traveled perhaps thousands of miles to meet it. The sailors aboard this ship are tired, weathered by months at sea, eager to reach port and feel solid ground beneath their feet once more. Yet even as they dream of warm beds and fresh food in the company of people who speak their native tongue, something else travels with them. Hidden in the dark spaces below deck, in the corners where supplies are stored and ropes are coiled, small dark shapes move with purposes of their own. These are the rats, as much a part of seafaring life as sails and anchors, creatures so common aboard ships that their presence has long since ceased to draw any particular notice from the crew. These rats have grown fat and numerous during the long voyage, feeding on grain that leaked from poorly sealed containers, on scraps of food that fell during meals, on anything edible they could find in their wooden world that rocks and pitches with every wave. They have raised generations during this journey, their young growing up knowing only the confined world of the ship's interior, becoming bold and clever in ways that will serve them well in the new environment they are about to discover. But the rats are not traveling alone. In their fur, so tiny as to be invisible to any casual observer, other passengers have taken up residence. These are the fleas, creatures so small that a dozen could dance on a fingernail, yet each one carrying within its minute body something that will prove far more powerful than all the ship's cargo combined. They have fed on the blood of their rat hosts throughout the voyage, multiplying in the warm, humid environment below deck, creating populations that exist entirely unnoticed by the human crew going about their daily duties above. As the ship draws closer to your harbor, you might notice it as a distant speck on the horizon, growing gradually larger as the hours pass. If you pause in your work to watch its approach, you see nothing unusual about its appearance. The sails catch the wind in the familiar way of all sailing vessels. The hull rides the waves with the practiced grace of a ship that has weathered many storms, and from this distance everything appears exactly as it should for a merchant vessel seeking safe harbor after a long journey. The excitement of an arriving ship begins to spread through your community in the gentle way that news always travels in a place where everyone knows everyone else. Children run between houses, calling out that a ship is coming. Women pause in their washing to shield their eyes and peer toward the harbor. Men working in fields closer to shore straighten their backs and gaze seaward, wondering what goods this vessel might carry and what stories its crew might tell. You feel this excitement yourself, that pleasant anticipation that comes with the promise of something different, breaking the comfortable routine of your days. Perhaps there will be spices that will transform your simple meals into something more flavorful. Maybe there will be cloth of a quality and color that you have never seen before. Possibly there will be tools or implements that will make some aspect of your work easier or more efficient. As the ship navigates the familiar channels that lead into your harbor, guided by landmarks that every local sailor knows by heart, the crew prepares for landing with the practiced efficiency of men who have performed these same tasks countless times before. Ropes are checked, anchors are readied, and personal belongings are gathered in preparation for whatever period of rest and resupply awaits them in your port. But in the hidden spaces below, other preparations are taking place entirely without human awareness or intention. The rats sense the change in the ship's movement as it enters calmer water. Their keen senses detect new smells drifting through cracks in the wooden hull, scents that speak of land and vegetation, and the particular mixture of odors that indicates a human settlement. These are creatures that have evolved over countless generations to be opportunistic, to recognize chances for expanding their territory and finding new sources of food. As the ship settles against the dock with the gentle bumping and creaking that accompanies every such arrival, the crew begins the process of unloading cargo. Heavy wooden crates are hauled up from the hold, their contents destined for the market stalls and merchant houses of your community. Sacks of grain and exotic foodstuffs follow, along with bolts of fabric, tools, and all the varied goods that make trade between distant places both profitable and necessary. During this bustling activity, while attention is focused on the valuable cargo and the business of commerce, the rats begin their own quiet exodus. They move with the stealth and intelligence that has made their species successful in every environment they have ever encountered, slipping through shadows, following the ropes that tie the ship to the dock, finding the dozens of small pathways that connect the floating world they have known to the solid ground that represents new territory to be explored and claimed. You might catch a glimpse of one of these small gray shapes scurrying across the dock in your peripheral vision, but rats in a port are so common as to be practically invisible. They are simply part of the landscape, no more noteworthy than the seagulls that cry overhead or the crabs that scuttle between the rocks where the tide pools form. If you notice them at all, it is only to make a mental note to check that your own grain stores are properly sealed, a precaution that every household takes as a matter of routine. But these particular rats carry passengers that make them different from the familiar rodents that have always been part of your community's daily life. The fleas that have fed and multiplied during the long sea voyage are hungry for new hosts, new sources of the blood that sustains their simple but effective existence. As the rats disperse into your community, following instincts that lead them towards sources of food and shelter, the fleas go with them, ready to leap onto any warm-blooded creature that comes within range. Some of these fleas will find new rat hosts among the local population, continuing the cycle that has sustained them for generations beyond counting. But others will be less discriminating in their choice of victims. A flea's world is simple and direct. It seeks warmth, blood, and places to reproduce. Whether that warmth comes from a rat, or a cat, or a dog, or a human being, is a distinction that means nothing to a creature whose entire existence is focused on such basic needs. The first new hosts are likely to be the animals that live closest to the areas where ships dock and cargo is unloaded. The cats that hunt mice in the warehouses, keeping them relatively free of the rodent pests that would otherwise consume valuable stored goods. The dogs that belong to dock workers and merchant families, animals that are accustomed to roaming freely through the commercial areas of your community. These creatures become the unknowing bridges that will carry the tiny passengers from their original rat hosts into the broader world of your settlement. Within days of the ship's arrival, though you have no way of knowing it, the fleas have begun to establish themselves throughout your community. They leap from animal to animal with an efficiency that would be admirable if it were not so ultimately destructive. A cat hunting mice near the granary picks up several fleas from a recently arrived rat. That same cat returning home brings its new passengers into a household where they may transfer to other pets, or to the human inhabitants, or simply take up residence in the warm, sheltered environment of a human dwelling. Meanwhile, the cargo from the ship has been distributed to various merchants and craftspeople throughout your community. Grain has been added to existing stores, fabric has been cut and sewn into clothing, tools have been sold to farmers and artisans who will use them in their daily work. The normal processes of trade and commerce have integrated the ship's goods into the economic life of your settlement, and everything appears to be proceeding exactly as it has countless times before. But along with the visible cargo, other things have been distributed as well. Some of the grain sacks carried stowaways, rats that remained hidden during the unloading process, and were transported directly to storage areas throughout your community. Some of the fabric bales provided temporary shelter for fleas that were separated from their original hosts during the busy activity at the docks. Even some of the wooden containers that held various goods may have harbored tiny passengers in their cracks and crevices. You begin to notice small changes in your daily environment, though at first, none of them seem particularly significant. There seems to be more activity in your cellar during the night, small sounds of movement that suggest the local rat population may have increased somewhat. This is not particularly alarming, as rat numbers tend to fluctuate with the seasons and the availability of food, but it does mean you need to be more careful about securing anything edible. In the market, conversations begin to include more frequent mentions of pest problems. Merchants complain about damage to stored goods. Housewives exchange tips for keeping rodents out of grain supplies. Children are warned more often about leaving food scraps where they might attract unwanted visitors. These are all normal concerns in any community, but there seems to be a slight increase in their frequency and urgency. More subtly, you might notice changes in the behavior of some of the animals in your community. Cats that were once content to patrol limited territories now seem more restless, ranging further in their hunting expeditions. Dogs scratch themselves more frequently, and some develop patches of irritated skin that their owners attribute to changes in weather or diet. Horses and other livestock show signs of discomfort that are difficult to diagnose, small changes in behavior that experienced animal handlers notice but cannot easily explain. The most observant members of your community begin to report an increase in what they describe as the general smell of vinegar in certain areas. The sharp, acidic scent seems to hang in the air around the market, near the docks, and in some of the more crowded residential areas. At first, people assume this is related to some kind of cleaning effort, as vinegar is commonly used to clean and preserve food, and to sanitize areas where many people gather. But the smell persists and even seems to grow stronger, accompanied by other odors that are harder to identify but somehow unsettling. There is a mustiness that suggests dampness or decay, mixed with the sharper smell of vinegar, and something else that makes people wrinkle their noses and move a bit more quickly through certain areas. Some of the older residents begin to use vinegar more liberally in their own homes, both as a cleaning agent and because they have heard that strong scents can ward off various kinds of illness. As these small changes accumulate over the days following the ship's arrival, a subtle undercurrent of unease begins to develop in your community. Nothing dramatic has happened, nothing that would cause panic or alarm, but there is a growing sense that something is not quite right. Conversations include more frequent pauses, moments where people seem to be listening for something they cannot quite identify. Glances linger a bit longer on neighbors' faces, searching for signs of fatigue or discomfort that might explain the vague feeling of unease that has begun to permeate daily life. The whispers begin quietly, as whispers always do. Someone mentions that they have not seen old Henrik for several days, though his house shows signs of habitation. Someone else notes that the baker's wife has seemed unusually tired lately, moving more slowly through her daily routines. A child asks why the blacksmith's dog has been whimpering more than usual, and receives an answer that satisfies the child, but leaves the adult feeling vaguely troubled. These whispers are not yet about illness, not yet about anything that could be called a crisis. They are simply the normal expression of a community's collective awareness that something in their shared environment has shifted. People who have lived together for years develop an almost unconscious sensitivity to changes in the familiar patterns of daily life, and these small alterations in routine behavior and atmosphere have begun to register in the collective consciousness of your settlement. You find yourself participating in these whispered conversations, adding your own observations to the growing collection of small concerns. You mention the increased activity in your cellar, the way your cat has been behaving strangely, the odd smell that seems to linger in certain parts of town. None of these things seem significant on their own, but when combined with similar reports from others, they begin to form a pattern that feels somehow ominous. The ship that brought all of these changes has long since departed, its crew having completed their business and continued on to other ports along their regular route, They carry with them some of the goods produced by your community, extending the web of trade and commerce that connects your small settlement to the broader world. But they have also left behind something that will prove far more significant than any cargo they took away. In the quiet moments of early morning or late evening, when the bustle of daily activity subsides, and you can hear the subtle sounds that are usually masked by human noise, you become aware of a different quality to the life around you. There are more small sounds in the darkness, more movement in the shadows, more of the tiny disturbances that indicate an increase in the population of creatures that prefer to conduct their business out of sight of human observers. The fleas continue their simple but effective existence, feeding and reproducing and spreading throughout your community with an efficiency that would be remarkable if anyone were aware of it. They have found abundant hosts among the local animal population, and some have begun to discover that human blood provides just as satisfactory nourishment as the blood of rats or cats or dogs. Most people experience these early flea bites as minor irritations, small red marks that itch for a day or two and then disappear. There is nothing unusual about such bites, particularly during warmer weather when various insects become more active. Families share remedies for reducing the itching. Mothers check their children's skin for signs of bites that might become infected if scratched too vigorously, and life continues with only these small additions to the normal catalog of minor discomforts that are part of everyone's daily experience. But some of these fleas carry within their tiny bodies something that transforms their bites from mere irritations into deliveries of devastation. They carry bacteria, microorganisms so small as to be invisible to any form of observation available in your time, yet capable of reproducing and spreading through a human host with consequences that will soon become apparent in ways that no one in your community can yet imagine. The smell of vinegar grows stronger, and fear begins to mix with it in proportions that change daily as more people notice the changes in their environment and begin to suspect that these changes might be connected to something more serious than seasonal variations or temporary inconveniences. The whispers in the market become more frequent and more urgent, though still focused on observations rather than accusations or panic. You realize that you are no longer simply living your normal life with a few minor annoyances added to it. You are now existing in the early stages of something that has not yet been named or fully recognized, but which has already begun to reshape the invisible landscape of your community in ways that will soon become impossible to ignore. Why You Wouldn't Survive the Plague Chapter 3. The symptoms. Picture yourself waking one morning in your familiar bed, in the house where you have spent countless peaceful nights, surrounded by the gentle sounds and scents that have marked the rhythm of your days for as long as you can remember. The light filtering through your small window carries the same golden quality it has always possessed, and the distant sounds of your community beginning another day drift through the air with their usual comforting predictability. Yet something feels different, though at first you cannot quite identify what has changed. You lie still for a moment, listening to your own body in the way that people do when they sense that something is not quite as it should be. Your breathing feels slightly labored, though you have done nothing to exert yourself. There is a heaviness in your limbs that seems disproportionate to the simple act of waking, and when you shift your position in the bed, you notice that your skin feels strangely sensitive against the rough fabric of your bedding. The first sign might be nothing more than a subtle feeling of discomfort, the kind of vague unease that sometimes precedes the onset of what you might hope is merely a common cold or the minor illnesses that everyone experiences from time to time. You tell yourself that perhaps you slept poorly or that the changing weather has affected your usual sense of well-being. In your time before the development of modern medicine, every small deviation from perfect health carries with it both the hope that it will pass quickly and the fear that it might develop into something more serious. As you rise from your bed and begin your morning routine, you become increasingly aware that the heaviness you felt upon waking is not dissipating as it normally would. Instead, it seems to be settling more deeply into your body, accompanied by a growing sense that your skin is somehow too warm, as if you had spent time too close to a fire and retained more heat than your body knows how to release. You move through your familiar tasks with increasing difficulty, finding that actions which normally require no conscious thought now demand more effort than they should. Lifting the water bucket feels more challenging than usual. Bending to tend the fire in your hearth leaves you feeling slightly dizzy. When you step outside to greet the morning air, you find that the temperature, which should feel refreshing after the warmth of your house, instead feels uncomfortably cool against your skin. This sensation of being simultaneously too warm and too cold becomes more pronounced as the morning progresses. Your body seems unable to regulate its temperature in the way it has always done automatically, leaving you caught between the discomfort of feeling overheated and the chill that makes you want to wrap yourself in every available piece of cloth. You find yourself adding layers of clothing, then removing them, then adding them again in a futile attempt to find some comfortable middle ground. By midday, the fever has established itself as an undeniable presence in your body. It begins as a gentle warmth that might almost be pleasant if it were not accompanied by that persistent chill, but gradually intensifies until you feel as though your blood has become too hot for your veins to contain comfortably. Your skin takes on a flushed appearance that others begin to notice, and when concerned neighbors or family members press their hands to your forehead, they pull back with expressions of worry at the heat radiating from your body. The fever brings with it a peculiar distortion of perception that makes familiar things seem strange and dreamlike. Colors appear more vivid than usual, sounds seem to echo more than they should, and the boundaries between waking and sleeping become increasingly blurred. You find yourself drifting in and out of awareness, sometimes snapping back to full consciousness with the startling realization that you have lost track of time entirely. As the fever deepens, it becomes accompanied by chills that shake your entire body with their intensity. These are not the mild shivers that might accompany a common cold, but violent tremors that make it impossible to hold anything steady in your hands and leave your teeth chattering despite the heat that burns within you. The contradiction between the fire in your blood and the ice that seems to have settled in your bones creates a profound discomfort that no amount of blankets or proximity to the hearth can seem to alleviate. During this period of intense fever and chills, you begin to notice other changes in your body that are more alarming than the temperature fluctuations. There is a tenderness developing in certain areas, particularly under your arms, that starts as a minor soreness but gradually intensifies into a more significant discomfort. When you explore these areas with gentle touches, you discover small lumps that were not there the day before, swellings that feel warm and tender under your fingertips. These swellings, which will eventually grow to the size of eggs or even larger, represent your body's attempt to fight off the infection that has taken hold in your system. Your lymph nodes, though you have no name for them or understanding of their function are working desperately to filter out the toxins that have invaded your bloodstream. But instead of successfully eliminating the threat, they become overwhelmed and begin to swell with the infected material they cannot process quickly enough. The buboes, as they will later be called by those who study such things, develop most commonly in the areas where lymph nodes are concentrated. Under your arms, in your groin, along your neck, these painful swellings emerge like small mountains of inflamed flesh, hot to the touch and increasingly sensitive to any pressure or movement. As they grow larger, they begin to affect your ability to move normally, making it painful to lift your arms or walk without discomfort. The pain from these swellings is unlike anything you have experienced before. It is not the sharp, immediate pain of an injury or the dull ache of overworked muscles, but rather a throbbing, persistent discomfort that seems to pulse in rhythm with your heartbeat. The skin over the swellings becomes stretched and shiny, taking on a purplish hue that speaks of the pressure building within them. As your condition worsens, the fever begins to affect your mental state in ways that are both frightening and confusing. Your thoughts become jumbled and difficult to organize, and you find yourself saying things that make perfect sense to you, but seem to alarm those who are caring for you. The delirium that accompanies high fever transforms your familiar world into a landscape of shadows and distortions, where the faces of loved ones might suddenly appear threatening, or where conversations with people who are not actually present seem completely natural. During these periods of delirium, you might find yourself reliving memories from years past with such vivid intensity that they feel more real than your current surroundings. You might have lengthy conversations with deceased relatives, or become convinced that you are in a different place entirely, perhaps the home of your childhood, or a location from a journey you took years ago. These experiences are so compelling that when moments of clarity return, you feel disoriented and confused about which reality is true. The delirium is often accompanied by hallucinations that can be both visual and auditory. You might see things moving in your peripheral vision that disappear when you turn to look directly at them. Sounds might seem to come from directions that make no sense, or you might hear voices calling your name when no one else is present. These distortions of perception add to the fear and confusion experienced by both you and those who are trying to care for you. As the infection progresses, your digestive system becomes increasingly affected by the toxins circulating in your bloodstream. What begins as a loss of appetite and mild nausea gradually develops into more severe symptoms that leave you unable to keep food or even water in your stomach for any significant period. The vomiting that accompanies advanced stages of the plague is violent and persistent, further weakening your already compromised body and making it nearly impossible to maintain the nutrition and hydration you need to fight the infection. The contents of your stomach, when expelled, often carry a dark coffee ground appearance that speaks to the internal bleeding that has begun to occur as the infection affects the lining of your digestive tract. This bleeding, invisible from the outside, represents another way in which your body is losing the battle against the disease that has invaded your system. Perhaps most disturbing of all the symptoms that develop as the plague progresses through your body is the gradual darkening of your extremities. Your fingers and toes, and sometimes larger areas of your hands and feet, begin to take on a dusky purplish color that gradually deepens to black. This change occurs as the circulation to these areas becomes compromised by the infection, leaving the tissues without adequate blood supply to maintain their normal, healthy appearance and function. The blackening of your fingers begins at the tips and gradually spreads backward toward your hands. The affected areas become cold to the touch and increasingly insensitive, as if they were no longer fully part of your body. This process is not painful in the way that the fever and swellings are painful, but it carries with it a profound sense of wrongness that is perhaps even more disturbing than outright pain would be. As these areas darken, they also begin to feel different when you touch them, taking on a leathery texture that seems alien and frightening. The normal flexibility of your fingers becomes compromised, making it difficult to grasp objects or perform the simple manual tasks that have been automatic throughout your life. When you look at your own hands, they begin to seem like the hands of a stranger, transformed by the disease into something that no longer feels entirely human. The progression of all these symptoms follows a timeline that is both predictable and terrifyingly rapid. What begins as a simple feeling of being unwell escalates within hours to obvious illness, and within days to a condition that leaves you bedridden and dependent on others for even the most basic care. The speed with which the plague transforms a healthy person into someone who is clearly gravely ill is one of the most frightening aspects of the disease, leaving little time for adaptation or preparation. Most people who contract the plague experience the full progression of symptoms within 3 to 5 days of the initial onset of fever. This compressed timeline means that there is little opportunity for gradual adjustment to illness, little time for the body to mount an effective defense, and little chance for caregivers to develop strategies for managing the various symptoms as they emerge. During these final days, as your body struggles against an infection that has overwhelmed its natural defenses, you drift in and out of consciousness with increasing frequency. The periods of clarity become shorter and less frequent, while the times of delirium and confusion expand to fill most of your waking hours. Your breathing becomes more labored, and the simple act of taking air into your lungs requires conscious effort in a way that it never has before. The fever that has burned in your body for days reaches levels that make coherent thought nearly impossible. Your skin radiates heat that can be felt by anyone who comes near you, yet you continue to experience chills that make you feel as though you will never be warm again. The contradictions in your body's responses to the infection create a state of profound discomfort that cannot be alleviated by any of the remedies available in your time. Your family and neighbors, those brave souls who have remained to care for you, despite the obvious risks to their own health, watch helplessly as the disease takes its inevitable course. They offer what comfort they can, providing cool cloths for your fevered brow, attempting to give you small sips of water when your stomach will accept them, and maintaining their vigil beside your bed, even when you are too delirious to recognize their presence. In your final hours, the accumulated effects of days of high fever, dehydration, and the toxic burden of the infection combine to create a state where your body simply cannot continue to maintain the basic functions necessary for life. Your breathing becomes irregular and shallow, your heartbeat weakens, and the fever that has tormented you finally begins to subside as your body's systems shut down one by one. The plague that entered your community so quietly, carried by invisible passengers on a merchant ship, has completed its work in your body with the same silent efficiency with which it arrived. In the space of less than a week, you have traveled from perfect health through increasingly severe illness to a conclusion that leaves your loved ones grieving and your community one person smaller, one family broken, one more empty space in the tapestry of daily life that will take time to heal. This is the nature of the plague, the reason why it has been feared throughout human history, not just for its lethality, but for its speed, its unpredictability, and its ability to transform healthy communities into places of mourning in the space of days rather than weeks or months. The symptoms that develop so rapidly and progress so relentlessly leave little room for hope, little time for adaptation, and little chance for the kind of gradual adjustment to illness that might allow for recovery or at least peaceful acceptance of what is to come. Why you wouldn't survive the plague. Chapter 4. The sound of the dead cart. Allow yourself to drift into the early morning stillness of a medieval town where the first light of dawn has not yet begun to warm the stone and timber buildings that line the narrow streets. In normal times, this would be the most peaceful hour of the day, when only the earliest risers would be stirring, perhaps the baker lighting his ovens, or the dairymaid beginning her rounds. The air would carry the gentle sounds of a community slowly awakening, birds singing from their roosts in the eaves, the distant lowing of cattle in fields beyond the town walls. But these are no longer normal times, and the sounds that now mark the beginning of each day have changed in ways that transform the very character of morning itself. Instead of the familiar, comforting rhythm of daily life beginning anew, there is now a different sound that cuts through the pre-dawn quiet with a regularity that has become both expected and dreaded. The first bell begins its toll while the stars are still visible in the sky above your shuttered windows. It is not the cheerful bell of the church calling people to morning prayers, nor the practical bell that might signal the opening of the market or the beginning of the working day. This bell carries a deeper, more solemn tone, ringing with a measured cadence that speaks of purposes far removed from celebration or simple communication. As you lie in your bed, perhaps having finally fallen into a fitful sleep after hours of listening to the restless sounds of your family around you, the tolling of that first bell penetrates your consciousness with the inevitability of sunrise itself. You know even before you are fully awake what that sound means. You know that somewhere in your community, another household has placed a simple cloth or ribbon outside their door, the agreed-upon signal that death has visited during the night, and that their burden now requires the attention of those who have taken on the grim responsibility of collection and disposal. The sound of the bell is soon joined by other sounds that have become as familiar as they are unwelcome. The slow, irregular rhythm of wheels moving over cobblestones creates a background percussion that speaks of heavy loads being transported with neither haste nor ceremony. These are not the quick, purposeful sounds of merchants' carts heading to market, nor the steady clip-clop of horses pulling families to Sunday services. The wheels of the dead cart move with a different rhythm entirely, pausing frequently, sometimes stopping for long periods before resuming their measured progress through streets that were once filled with the sounds of ordinary life. You find yourself listening despite your desire not to, tracking the progress of the cart through your neighborhood by the subtle changes in the sound as it moves closer to or farther from your own dwelling. When the wheels encounter the smoother stones near the fountain in the town square, their sound becomes more muffled. When they pass over the rougher cobbles of the older sections of town, each revolution becomes more distinct, creating a rhythm that seems to echo in your chest long after the cart has moved beyond the range of your hearing. Mixed with the sound of wheels and the periodic tolling of the bell comes another sound that has become part of the terrible routine of these plague-stricken days. It is a human voice, though one that has been changed by repetition and necessity into something that barely sounds human anymore. The words themselves are simple and practical, a call that serves the same function as any other announcement made by those who move through communities providing necessary services. Bring out your dead, comes the call, neither shouted nor whispered, but spoken in a tone that carries clearly through the morning air while remaining somehow emotionally neutral, as if the speaker has found a way to disconnect the meaning of the words from their emotional impact. The voice has the quality of someone who has repeated these same words so many times that they have become merely sounds, divorced from their terrible significance through the simple necessity of daily repetition. The first time you heard this call weeks ago, when the plague was still something that affected other neighborhoods, other families, it seemed like something from a nightmare or a story told to frighten children. The idea that such words could become routine, that someone's job could consist of moving through familiar streets, calling for the dead to be brought out like any other commodity, seemed too horrible to be real. But now, as the call echoes through your own neighborhood with the regularity of any other daily service, you understand how quickly the unthinkable can become mundane when survival depends on accepting new realities. Following the voice comes the sound of footsteps, multiple sets moving with the tired gait of people who have been walking for hours and know they have many more hours of walking ahead of them. These are the footsteps of the dead cartmen, volunteers or paid workers who have taken on one of the most dangerous and necessary jobs in your plague-stricken community. They move from door to door, collecting the cloth markers that indicate their services are needed, and then waiting with whatever patience they can muster while families complete the difficult process of bringing their dead to the street. The sound of doors opening and closing becomes more frequent as the cart progresses through your neighborhood. Each opening door represents a family that has lost someone during the night, and each closing door marks another small ritual of farewell conducted in the shadow of fear and necessity. Sometimes these doors open quickly, as if the families inside are eager to complete the terrible transaction and retreat to whatever privacy their grief allows. Other times, the doors remain closed for long minutes after the call has been made, suggesting the internal struggles taking place as people prepare to hand over their loved ones to strangers. When the bodies are finally brought out, you can hear the subtle sounds of their transfer from the care of families to the custody of the cartmen. There is the soft thud of weight being lifted and placed, the brief murmur of voices as final words are exchanged, sometimes the sound of weeping that cannot be entirely contained despite efforts to maintain dignity and composure. These sounds create a mosaic of human tragedy that plays out multiple times as the cart makes its way through streets that once knew only the sounds of ordinary commerce and social interaction. The cart itself, when loaded, makes a different sound as it continues its rounds. The wheels now carry more weight, and their contact with the cobblestones becomes more pronounced, more deliberate. The wooden frame creaks under its burden, and sometimes there are other sounds, small shifting noises that speak of the practical realities of transporting multiple bodies in a vehicle that was never designed for such purposes. As the morning progresses and the cart becomes more heavily loaded, its progress becomes slower and more labored. The intervals between stops become longer, as if the crew needs more time to rest between the physical and emotional demands of their work. The bell continues to toll periodically, but now it seems less like an announcement and more like a funeral dirge, marking the passage of the cart through a community that has learned to measure time by the rhythm of death rather than the rhythm of life. From behind your shuttered windows, You follow this terrible procession through your neighborhood and beyond, listening as the sounds gradually fade into the distance as the cart makes its way toward whatever destination has been designated for the disposal of the dead. In normal times, each death in your community would be marked by individual ceremonies, personal rituals of grief and remembrance that honored the life that had ended and provided comfort to those left behind. But the plague has made such individual attention impossible, transforming death from a personal tragedy into a logistical problem that must be managed efficiently to prevent even greater catastrophe. The destination of the dead cart is something that everyone knows about, but few discuss openly. Beyond the walls of your town, in areas that were once used for other purposes, great pits have been excavated to receive the growing numbers of bodies that can no longer be accommodated in the traditional burial grounds. These pits represent a practical solution to an unprecedented problem, but they also represent a fundamental change in how your community relates to death and the proper treatment of the deceased. The sound of the cart returning, now empty, carries a different quality entirely. The wheels move more quickly over the cobblestones, freed from their heavy burden, and there is sometimes even the sound of conversation among the crew members, as if the completion of their grim task has allowed them to return temporarily to more normal human interactions. But even these lighter sounds carry undertones of exhaustion and the knowledge that tomorrow will bring another round of the same terrible routine. As the immediate sounds of the dead cart fade, other sounds begin to emerge that speak to the ways in which your community is adapting to this new reality. There is the sound of shutters closing more firmly as families retreat into whatever isolation their dwellings can provide. There is the sound of bolts being drawn across doors as people seek whatever security can be found in physical barriers against the invisible threat that moves through their community. But closing shutters and barring doors cannot keep out the sounds that have become part of daily life in your plague-stricken town. The dead cart will return tomorrow and the day after, and for as many days as necessary until either the plague runs its course or there are no longer enough living people to maintain even this basic service. The bell will toll, the call will echo through streets that grow emptier with each passing day, and the wheels will continue their measured progress over cobblestones that have witnessed the transformation of a community from a place of life and hope into something entirely different. The psychological impact of these daily sounds cannot be overstated. In normal times, the sounds of your community provided comfort and reassurance, creating an auditory landscape that spoke of continuity, routine, and the reliable presence of friends and neighbors going about their familiar activities. But now, the dominant sounds speak only of loss, fear, and the constant presence of death as an active force in your daily environment. Children who once played in the streets now listen from behind closed doors to sounds they cannot fully understand, but which they recognize as frightening and wrong. Adults who once greeted each new day with energy and purpose now lie awake before dawn, dreading the first sound of the bell and wondering whether today will be the day when the call stops outside their own door. The dead cart becomes not just a practical necessity, but a symbol of how completely the plague has transformed your world. It represents the reduction of human dignity to logistical efficiency, the transformation of individual tragedy into mass processing, and the replacement of hope with a grim determination to simply survive another day. The sight of bodies being piled into carts like cordwood, violates every principle of respect for the dead that your community has maintained for generations. Yet it has become as routine as any other daily service. As you listen to these sounds from behind your shuttered windows, you are forced to confront the reality that closing yourself off from the visual evidence of the plague's devastation does nothing to protect you from its auditory assault. The sounds penetrate every barrier you can construct, carrying with them not just the immediate evidence of death, but also the constant reminder that this death is random, unpredictable, and potentially imminent. The shutters that you close so carefully each morning, hoping to create some barrier between your family and the horrors taking place in the streets outside, prove to be utterly inadequate against sounds that carry the full weight of your community's transformation. You can avoid seeing the bodies being loaded into carts, avoid witnessing the grief of neighbors as they surrender their loved ones to strangers, avoid the visual confirmation of how quickly familiar faces are disappearing from your daily life. But you cannot avoid hearing the evidence of all these things, and in some ways the sounds are more disturbing than the sights would be. Your imagination, fed by these auditory clues, creates images that may be worse than the reality, filling in details that sight might not provide, creating a soundtrack of horror that plays continuously in the background of your daily struggle to maintain some semblance of normal life. The dead cart becomes the metronome that marks the tempo of your new existence, a regular beat that measures not the passage of ordinary time, but the acceleration of catastrophe. Each morning brings the same sounds, but each morning also brings the awareness that those sounds are coming closer, affecting families that you know personally, removing people who were part of your daily interactions just days or weeks before. And always, underlying every other sound, is the knowledge that eventually, inevitably, the call will come for your own household, that the shutters you close so carefully to keep the world out will one day be opened by others seeking to bring out your own dead, adding your family's tragedy to the daily collection that has become as routine and necessary as the delivery of bread or the drawing of water from the community. Well, why you wouldn't survive the plague chapter 5. Remedies that never worked in the quiet, desperation that settles over your community like morning mist. People begin to reach for whatever remedies they can find, gathering knowledge passed down through generations and combining it with new ideas born from fear and hope in equal measure. Your world is one where healing has always been as much art as science, where the boundary between medicine and magic remains fluid, and where the desperation of plague times transforms every household into a laboratory of experimental treatments. The first remedies that people turn to are the familiar ones, the herbs and preparations that have been used for generations to treat fever, pain, and the various ailments that have always been part of human existence. In your small garden, or in the carefully tended plots that many families maintain near their homes, certain plants have always held places of honor, not for their beauty or their food value, but for their reputation as healers of human suffering. Rosemary, with its needle-like leaves that release their pungent fragrance when crushed between your fingers, has long been valued for its supposed ability to ward off evil influences and purify the air around those who carry it. In these plague times, people begin wearing sprigs of rosemary pinned to their clothing, tucking bundles of it under their pillows, and burning it in their hearths to fill their homes with its sharp, clean scent. The aromatic smoke that rises from these small fires carries with it not just the herb's distinctive fragrance, but also the hopes of those who believe that pleasant scents might drive away whatever invisible forces are causing such devastation in their community. Lavender, treasured in peaceful times for its gentle fragrance and its ability to promote restful sleep, now takes on new significance as people desperately search for anything that might provide protection against the plague. Small cloth pouches filled with dried lavender flowers are sewn into clothing, hung around necks on simple cords, and placed in every corner of homes where the herb's sweet scent might create a barrier against infection. Women who once used lavender primarily to scent their linens and clothing now crush the flowers between their palms multiple times throughout the day, inhaling deeply in the hope that the familiar fragrance might somehow cleanse their bodies of whatever corruption the plague brings. Thyme, sage, and mint join this growing arsenal of aromatic defenses, their various scents combining to create an olfactory landscape that speaks of human determination to fight the invisible with the tangible. People walk through their communities carrying small bundles of mixed herbs, holding them close to their noses and breathing deeply as they move through areas where the risk of infection seems highest. The market square, the church, the wells where water is drawn for daily use, all become places where the air shimmers with the combined fragrances of dozens of different herbal preparations as people attempt to create personal atmospheres of protection. But herbs alone seem insufficient against the growing tide of illness, and soon more dramatic remedies begin to appear as people search for treatments that match the severity of the plague they are fighting. The ancient practice of bloodletting, which has been used for centuries to treat various ailments by supposedly removing corrupted blood from the body, takes on new urgency and frequency as families watch their loved ones succumb to fever and delirium despite all gentler treatments. The tools of bloodletting are simple but effective in their primary purpose of releasing blood from the human body. Sharp knives, carefully cleaned and sometimes heated over flames in an attempt to purify them, are used to make small cuts in the arms or legs of plague victims. The belief that guides this practice suggests that the illness resides in the blood itself, and that by releasing some of the corrupted blood, the body might be able to restore itself to health using whatever clean blood remains. Leeches, those dark segmented creatures that attach themselves to human skin and feed on blood with single-minded efficiency, become valuable commodities as people seek ways to remove blood from the body without causing the larger wounds that knife cutting requires. These creatures, collected from ponds and streams by those brave enough to wade into stagnant water where disease might lurk, are applied to the skin of plague victims in the hope that their natural feeding behavior might draw out whatever poisons the disease has introduced into the bloodstream. The sight of a plague victim covered with dark leeches, lying pale and still while the creatures slowly engorge themselves with blood, becomes tragically common in homes throughout your community. Family members watch with a mixture of hope and horror as the leeches work, praying that each drop of blood removed might bring their loved one closer to recovery, while fearing that the treatment itself might prove more harmful than the disease it is meant to cure. As these traditional remedies prove inadequate against the plague's relentless advance, people begin to experiment with more extreme measures born from desperation and the growing belief that ordinary treatments are insufficient for an extraordinary disease. The burning of sulfur, a yellow mineral that produces choking, acrid smoke when ignited, becomes a common practice based on the theory that the plague might be driven away by creating an environment so unpleasant that even disease cannot survive in it. Households throughout your community begin to fill with the harsh chemical smell of burning sulfur as people ignite small piles of the mineral in metal containers, hoping that the toxic smoke will somehow purify the air they breathe and the spaces they inhabit. The sulfur burns with a blue flame that flickers and dances in ways that seem almost supernatural, and the smoke that rises from it is so thick and caustic that it brings tears to the eyes and burns the throat of anyone who inhales it. Families gather around these small sulfur fires, covering their faces with damp cloths in an attempt to filter the worst of the toxic fumes, while still exposing themselves to what they hope are the purifying properties of the smoke. Children cough and cry as the acrid air fills their lungs, but parents persist in these treatments, believing that temporary discomfort is a small price to pay for protection against a disease that has already claimed so many lives in their community. The combination of burning sulfur with other aromatic substances creates an atmosphere in many homes that is almost unbearable for healthy people. Yet families endure these conditions day after day, hoping that their suffering in the present might purchase safety in the future. The air in these houses becomes thick with smoke and chemical fumes, making normal breathing difficult, and turning the simple act of staying indoors into an ordeal that tests the endurance of everyone involved. During this time of desperate experimentation with remedies, the figure of the plague doctor begins to appear in your community, a strange and terrifying presence that combines medical knowledge with superstition in ways that reflect the confusion and fear that characterize these plague times. These doctors, when they can be found and afforded, arrive wearing costumes that seem designed as much to inspire fear as to provide protection. The most distinctive feature of the plague doctor's appearance is the long beak-like mask that covers the entire face and extends forward in a point that resembles the bill of some enormous bird. This beak, crafted from leather and sometimes reinforced with metal, serves a practical purpose in the doctor's understanding of disease transmission. The hollow interior of the beak is stuffed with aromatic herbs, flowers, and spices, creating a personal atmosphere of supposedly purifying scents that the doctor breathes through a series of small holes at the tip of the beak. Inside these strange masks, combinations of dried roses, lavender, mint, cloves, and sometimes more exotic spices create fragrant mixtures that the doctors believe will filter and purify the air they breathe while treating plague victims. The theory behind this practice suggests that disease travels through corrupted air, and that by breathing only through these aromatic filters, the doctors can expose themselves to infected patients without risking their own health. The sight of a plague doctor moving through your community, dressed in a long dark robe that covers the entire body and wearing the disturbing bird-like mask, creates an atmosphere of dread and hope in equal measure. Children hide behind their parents when these figures appear, frightened by the inhuman appearance of the costume, while adults feel both relief that medical help has arrived and fear of what the doctor's presence might mean about the severity of their situation. These doctors carry with them an array of instruments and supplies that represent the most advanced medical knowledge available in your time, yet their treatments often prove as ineffective as the home remedies that desperate families have already tried. They perform bloodletting with more precision and ceremony than untrained family members can manage, but the results are often the same. They prescribe combinations of herbs and minerals that are more complex than anything a household might devise independently, but these elaborate preparations rarely succeed where simpler treatments have failed. The wealthy members of your community, those with the resources to consider options beyond the reach of ordinary families, begin to make a different kind of choice entirely as the plague establishes its hold on your town. Rather than remain and fight the disease with herbs, bloodletting, and burning sulfur, they choose the remedy of distance, packing their belongings and departing for country estates, distant relatives, or any location that might offer safety through isolation from the infected community. These departures begin quietly, with individual families simply disappearing from their usual places in the community's daily life. The wealthy merchant who normally presides over the largest stall in the market square is suddenly absent, his usual location filled by a relative or employee who explains apologetically that the master has been called away on urgent business. The prosperous landowner who typically attends church services in the finest clothing available gradually stops appearing at weekly gatherings, and inquiries about his absence receive vague responses about travel or family obligations. As the plague spreads and the death toll rises, these individual departures become more obvious and more frequent. Entire households that once formed important parts of your community's social and economic structure simply vanish, leaving behind empty houses that quickly develop the abandoned appearance of buildings where no one lights fires, opens shutters, or maintains the daily routines that keep dwellings looking lived in and cared for. The servants and workers who depended on these wealthy families for their livelihoods find themselves in an impossible situation, caught between loyalty to employers who have abandoned them and the necessity of finding new ways to survive in a community increasingly devastated by plague. Some of these servants attempt to follow their employers to whatever distant refuges they have chosen, but most lack the resources for travel or the connections that might gain them entry to households in uninfected areas. These abandoned servants, left behind to face the plague without the protection that wealth might have provided, often become some of the most vulnerable members of your community. Without steady employment or the security of established households, they must find new ways to survive while the plague eliminates more and more of the economic opportunities that once sustained them. Some band together, forming temporary households that pool resources and provide mutual support during the crisis. Others seek shelter and work with families that still remain in the community, trading labor for basic necessities and a place to sleep safely. The houses left empty by the departing wealthy families become strange landmarks in your community, reminders of the different options available to those with sufficient resources to purchase safety through distance. These abandoned homes, with their shuttered windows and unused gardens, serve as daily reminders that survival during plague times depends as much on wealth and social position as it does on health, luck, or the effectiveness of any remedy that might be attempted. As traditional remedies continue to fail and the wealthy exercise their option of flight, the remaining members of your community begin to turn towards spiritual solutions with an intensity that reflects their growing desperation. Prayer, which has always been a part of daily life in your time, takes on new urgency and frequency as people search for divine intervention in a situation that seems to have moved beyond human ability to control or understand. The prayers that arise from your plague-stricken community begin as the familiar formulas that have always been used to request divine protection and healing. Families gather to recite traditional prayers for the sick, lighting candles and making offerings in the hope that established religious practices might prove effective against this new threat. Churches that remain open become focal points for community prayer, with people gathering despite the risk of infection to participate in services that combine traditional worship with desperate pleas for divine mercy. But as the plague continues, its relentless advance in traditional prayers seem to go unanswered. The nature of prayer in your community begins to change, transforming from peaceful requests for blessing into urgent negotiations with divine powers. People begin to offer specific bargains in their prayers, promising particular sacrifices or changes in behavior in exchange for protection from the plague or healing for family members who have already been stricken. These bargaining prayers reflect a fundamental shift in how people understand their relationship with divine power during times of extreme crisis. Rather than humbly requesting mercy and accepting whatever fate might be granted, people begin to approach prayer as a form of commerce, offering specific payments in exchange for specific results. A mother might promise to donate her finest possession to the church if her child recovers from plague symptoms. A father might vow to fast for a particular number of days if his wife's fever breaks. Entire families might commit to lives of increased devotion and charitable work if their household is spared from the disease that has claimed so many of their neighbors. The intensity of these bargaining prayers creates an atmosphere in homes and churches that reflects the desperation of people who have tried every physical remedy they can imagine and now turn to spiritual intervention as their final hope. Voices that once offered prayers with calm confidence now carry the edge of panic, and the words themselves become more elaborate and specific as people attempt to craft offers that might prove attractive to whatever divine powers control the fate of human communities. As these various remedies continue to fail and the plague advances through your community with seemingly unstoppable momentum, a grim understanding begins to settle over those who remain. The herbs that were supposed to purify the air continue to fill homes with pleasant fragrances, but people wearing rosemary and lavender still fall ill and die. The bloodletting that was meant to remove corrupted blood from the body often leaves patients weaker and more vulnerable rather than stronger and healthier. The burning sulfur that was intended to create an environment hostile to disease succeeds mainly in making homes uncomfortable for healthy people while doing nothing to slow the plague's spread. The plague doctors, with their frightening masks and elaborate preparations, prove no more effective than untrained family members applying home remedies. The wealthy, who fled to distant locations, may have purchased safety through distance, but their departure provides no help to those left behind and serves mainly to remind the remaining community of their limited options. Even the increasingly desperate prayers and bargains offered to divine powers seem to go unheeded as the plague continues to claim victims, regardless of their piety, devotion, or willingness to make sacrifices in exchange for protection. This accumulating evidence of failure across all attempted remedies creates a psychological atmosphere in your community that may be as dangerous as the plague itself. Hope, which has sustained people through the early stages of the crisis, begins to give way to despair as each new treatment proves as ineffective as the last. The energy that people have devoted to gathering herbs, performing bloodletting, burning sulfur, and offering prayers gradually transforms into a weary resignation that speaks of the exhaustion that comes from fighting an apparently unwinnable battle. Yet even in the face of this mounting evidence of the inadequacy of available remedies, people continue to try new combinations, new approaches, new bargains with fate, because the alternative to continued effort is an acceptance of helplessness that few human beings can sustain in the face of mortal threat. The failure of remedies becomes not a reason to stop trying, but a reason to try harder, to experiment with more extreme treatments, to offer more elaborate prayers, to search more desperately for the combination of actions that might finally prove effective against a disease that seems to mock every human attempt to understand or control it. Chapter 6. Quarantine and Lockdowns. Picture yourself standing at the edge of your medieval town on what would become the last ordinary morning of your life. The sun rises, as it always has, casting long shadows across cobblestone streets that have witnessed countless generations come and go. Children play in the narrow alleyways between timber-framed houses, their laughter echoing off walls that have stood for centuries. Merchants call out their wares from wooden stalls, the familiar sounds of commerce and community filling the air with a comforting rhythm. But today, something different hangs in the atmosphere. There's a tension you cannot quite name, a whisper of unease that seems to follow the morning breeze as it carries with it rumors from distant lands. The plague has been approaching your town for weeks now, moving like a slow, inevitable tide across the countryside. Travelers have brought stories of cities falling silent, of fields left unharvested, of roads that once bustled with trade, now empty, save for the occasional refugee stumbling forward with hollow eyes and desperate tales. Your local authorities have been meeting in hushed conferences, their faces growing more grave with each passing day. The church bells that once rang out in joyful celebration now toll with a different cadence, one that speaks of preparation for something terrible approaching on the horizon. As you watch the familiar scene of your town going about its daily business, you notice the first signs of the coming change. A merchant at the market square suddenly stops mid-sentence, his hand moving to his throat as if testing for something he hopes not to find. A mother pulls her child closer as they pass a group of strangers who have just arrived from the next town over. The baker's wife wipes her hands on her apron with more urgency than usual, and you catch sight of the town's physician hurrying toward the houses near the eastern gate, his medical bag clutched tightly in his weathered hands. The transformation begins not with dramatic proclamations or sudden chaos, but with a series of small, seemingly insignificant decisions that will reshape your world forever. The town council convenes in the early afternoon, their voices carrying through the wooden walls of the municipal building as they debate measures that seem both necessary and impossible. You hear fragments of their discussion drifting through windows left open to catch the last warm breeze of the season. Words like containment and isolation float on the air, abstract concepts that will soon become the harsh reality of your daily existence. By evening, the first official notices appear on the doors of the church and the town hall. The script is carefully written in the formal language of authority, but its meaning is clear and terrifying in its simplicity. The gates of your town are to be sealed at dawn. No one may enter, and more importantly, no one may leave. The decision has been made to protect those who remain healthy by cutting off all contact with the outside world, creating a barrier that will either save your community or trap you all within a dying cage of stone and timber. The night before the gates close forever feels like the last night of the world itself. Families gather around their hearth fires, speaking in hushed tones about relatives in neighboring towns they may never see again. Some pack bundles of belongings, though they have nowhere to go. Others write letters they know will never be delivered, pouring their hearts onto parchment that will remain forever sealed within the town's walls. The weight of isolation settles upon everyone like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. As dawn breaks on the first day of quarantine, you watch from your window as the massive wooden gates swing shut for what may be the final time. The iron bars slide into place with a sound like thunder, echoing off the stone walls that now define the boundaries of your entire world. The guards take their positions, but their faces show no triumph or satisfaction in their duty. They know, as you know, as everyone knows, that they are not just keeping others out, they are keeping death in, allowing it to move freely through the narrow streets and cramped houses where families live, pressed together in spaces too small for proper isolation. The rules of quarantine are simple in their cruelty and impossible in their implementation. Any house where illness appears must be immediately sealed, its occupants trapped inside regardless of who else lives there. A red cross painted on the door marks these homes as places of contagion, warning others to stay away while condemning those within to face their fate without help or comfort from the outside world. The logic is clear and heartless. Sacrifice the few to save the many, even when the few include your neighbors, your friends, your family members who happen to be in the wrong place when the sickness struck. You understand now why the merchants who could afford to leave departed weeks ago, why the wealthy families with estates in the countryside suddenly remembered urgent business that required their immediate attention. They saw what was coming and had the means to escape before the trap closed around your community. Those who remain are the ones who could not leave, who had nowhere else to go, who were too poor or too rooted in place to run from the approaching darkness. The first house to be sealed is that of the baker's family, the same people whose warm bread had filled your mornings with comfort and routine. The baker's eldest son had been complaining of a fever for several days, dismissing it as nothing more than a passing ailment. But when the telltale swellings appear beneath his arms, there is no longer any doubt about what has entered your community. The authorities arrive with their brushes and paint, marking the wooden door with the crimson cross that transforms a home into a tomb. You watch from your window as the baker's wife appears at her upstairs window, her face pale with terror and disbelief. She pounds on the glass with her fists, screaming words you cannot hear but understand perfectly. Inside that house are her husband, her 3 children, and her elderly mother who can barely walk. The sick son who brought the plague into their home lies fevered and delirious, unaware that his condition has condemned his entire family to share his fate. They have enough food for perhaps 3 days, assuming the sickness does not take their appetites away entirely. The guards who stand outside the sealed houses are not cruel men by nature, but they have been given orders that brook no compromise. They will not allow the doors to be opened for any reason. Food and water can be left outside if family members or neighbors are brave enough to approach, but no one may enter or leave until either the sickness passes or everyone inside is dead. The guards themselves stand at a distance, knowing that their duty requires them to remain healthy enough to continue their watch. They wrap cloth around their faces and burn herbs in small braziers, hoping these simple measures will protect them from the invisible death that seems to seep through walls and windows. Days pass with excruciating slowness, inside your town's walls. The normal rhythms of life continue for those not yet touched by the plague, but everything feels different now. The market square, once bustling with activity, becomes a place where people hurry through their business with downcast eyes and covered faces. Conversations are brief and conducted at a distance. Children no longer play in the streets, kept indoors by parents who understand that every contact with others carries the risk of contamination. The silence from the sealed houses grows more profound with each passing day. At first, you could hear voices from within, crying out for help, or simply talking to maintain some connection with the world beyond their walls. But as the sickness takes its course, these sounds fade away. The baker's house, which once filled the morning air with the sounds of early preparation and family conversation, now stands as quiet as a tomb. Smoke no longer rises from its chimney, and the windows remain dark even during the day. You begin to understand the true horror of the quarantine system. It is not just that the sick are left to die without medical care or comfort. It is that the healthy members of sealed households are forced to watch their loved ones deteriorate and die, knowing that they too will likely succumb to the same fate. A mother must tend to her fevered children while knowing that her care may be the very thing that seals her own doom. A husband must comfort his dying wife while counting the days until the sickness claims him as well. The psychological weight of this isolation presses down upon everyone in the community. Those who remain free begin to watch each other with suspicious eyes, looking for the first signs of fever or fatigue that might indicate the plague has found another victim. Neighbors who had been friends for decades now cross the street to avoid passing too close to one another. The bonds of community, built up over generations, begin to fray under the pressure of fear and survival. As more houses are sealed, the resources of the community are stretched beyond their limits. The town's physicians, what few there are, can do little more than confirm diagnoses and watch as families are condemned to their fate. The priests who once provided comfort to the dying now struggle with their own faith as they witness suffering on a scale that challenges their understanding of divine mercy. They continue to offer prayers and last rites, but they must do so from a distance, their words of comfort carried on the wind to those who will die alone and afraid. The practical challenges of maintaining quarantine become more apparent as the days stretch into weeks. The sealed houses require constant monitoring, but the guards assigned to this duty begin to fall ill themselves. Those who replace them are increasingly reluctant volunteers, men and women who understand that their service may be a death sentence, but who recognize that someone must maintain order even as their world collapses around them. Food becomes scarce as the town's normal supply chains are disrupted. The baker's family, who once provided bread for the entire community, now lies silent behind their sealed door. Other tradespeople suffer similar fates, their skills and services lost to the plague along with their lives. The remaining healthy residents must take on unfamiliar roles, learning to do work they never thought they would need to master. But even these efforts are hampered by the constant fear that any gathering of people might become a new source of infection. The children of the town suffer perhaps the most from the isolation and fear that permeates every aspect of daily life. They do not fully understand why they can no longer play with their friends, or why their parents speak in hushed, worried tones about neighbors who have simply disappeared behind sealed doors. Some of them develop a kind of premature wisdom, becoming quiet and watchful as they absorb the adult fears around them. Others retreat into themselves, finding comfort in imagination and fantasy as reality becomes too frightening to fully comprehend. The nights become particularly difficult as the sounds of the town change from the familiar noises of a living community to something more ominous. The absence of sounds from the sealed houses creates an eerie quiet, broken only by the footsteps of the guards making their rounds and the occasional cry of desperation from someone who has just received news of a loved one's fate. Sleep becomes elusive as people lie awake, wondering if they will be the next to feel the fever beginning in their bodies, or if they will wake to find a red cross painted on their own door. The isolation affects not just the physical health of the community, but its spiritual and emotional well-being as well. Religious services continue, but the congregation grows smaller each week as families either succumb to the plague or become too afraid to gather in groups. The church itself becomes a place of complex emotions, where prayers for deliverance mingle with anger at a God who seems to have abandoned his people to suffer and die in such a cruel manner. As the quarantine extends beyond what anyone initially imagined possible, the town begins to take on the characteristics of a prison. The walls that once protected the community from outside threats now trap the residents within an ever-shrinking circle of safety. The gates that once welcomed travelers and traders now stand as monuments to isolation and fear. The streets that once bustled with life now echo with the footsteps of fewer and fewer people each day. The authorities who implemented the quarantine begin to question their own decisions as the death toll mounts and the promised salvation fails to materialize. They had hoped that isolation would contain the plague and allow the community to wait out its passage. Instead, they find themselves overseeing a slow-motion catastrophe where the very measures designed to save lives may be ensuring that those lives are lost in the most cruel and lonely way possible. The red crosses on doors multiply like a grim arithmetic of despair. Each new mark represents not just one more case of illness, but an entire household condemned to face their fate alone. The painter who marks these doors begins to move through the town like a figure from a nightmare, his brush dripping with the crimson paint that has become the symbol of death itself. He performs his duty mechanically, no longer able to think about the families he condemns with each stroke of his brush. The quarantine that was meant to last for weeks stretches into months, and with each passing day, the town becomes more like a cemetery than a living community. The houses that once rang with the sounds of family life now stand silent, their windows dark, their doors marked with the cross that warns all to stay away. The survivors move through this landscape of death like ghosts, going through the motions of daily life, while knowing that their turn may come at any moment. In the end, you realize that the quarantine has become something worse than the plague itself. While the disease kills the body, the isolation kills the spirit of the community. The bonds that held neighbors together, the trust that allowed people to live side by side, the hope that gave meaning to daily struggles, all of these have been sacrificed in the name of survival. And still, the plague continues its work, moving from house to house, family to family, claiming lives with the same inexorable patience, whether the doors are sealed or open. The quarantine that was supposed to protect you has instead created a perfect environment for despair to flourish. Trapped within the town's walls, with no escape possible and no help coming from outside, you and your neighbors face the plague, not as a community united in adversity, but as isolated individuals, each family sealed in their own private hell, waiting for the end to come. Past Chapter 7. Isolation and Abandonment. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world still holds the promise of another ordinary day, you find yourself sitting beside your mother's bed, watching her chest rise and fall with the labored breathing that has become the rhythm of your existence. The plague has been in your house for nearly 2 weeks now, and in that time you have learned what it truly means to be alone in a world that once felt full of connections and support. The isolation that has settled around your family like a heavy shroud is not just physical but spiritual, cutting you off from every source of comfort and aid that once made life bearable during times of crisis. Your mother had been the strongest person you knew, the one who held the family together through harvests, both good and bad, who knew the right words to say when neighbors quarreled, who could make a feast from scraps and find hope in the darkest of circumstances. Now she lies motionless, except for the shallow movements of her breathing, her face pale and drawn, her body marked by the terrible swellings that announced the plague's arrival in your home. The woman who once filled every room with her presence now seems to be fading away, becoming translucent, as if the disease is slowly erasing her from the world. The first abandonment came from Father Benedict, the priest who had baptized you as an infant, who had blessed your home during times of celebration, who had always been there to provide spiritual comfort when death visited your community. For the first few days after your mother fell ill, you kept expecting to hear his familiar knock at your door, to see his kind face appearing at your window with words of prayer and consolation. You had watched him tend to the dying throughout your life, seen him hold the hands of the sick and offer last rites to those about to depart this world. His presence had always been a constant during times of suffering, a reminder that no one had to face death entirely alone. But as the days passed and the plague tightened its grip on your mother, you realized that Father Benedict would not be coming. The disease had changed the rules of compassion, making even the most devoted servants of God afraid to approach the homes where death was doing its work. You learned later that the priest had been instructed by his superiors to maintain his distance from plague houses, that his duty to preserve his own life so he could serve the larger community outweighed his obligation to comfort individual families in their final hours. The absence of spiritual comfort during your mother's illness weighs upon you like a stone in your chest. Throughout her life, she had been a woman of deep faith, attending morning prayers without fail, contributing to the church even when money was scarce, finding strength in the rituals and ceremonies that connected her to something larger than herself. Now, as she faces her final days, she does so without the blessing of a priest, without the comfort of last rites, without the assurance that her soul will be properly commended to God's care. You try to offer prayers yourself, but the words feel hollow and inadequate, lacking the authority and power that come from ordained hands. The friends who once filled your home with laughter and conversation have also disappeared, leaving behind only memories of better times. Maria, who had been your mother's closest companion for more than 30 years, who had shared every joy and sorrow with your family, now crosses to the other side of the street when she passes your house. You have seen her through the window, her face turned away, her steps quickening as she hurries past the door that once welcomed her warmly. The friendship that had weathered decades of shared experience cannot survive the terror of the plague. Thomas the carpenter, who had been like a brother to your father, and who had continued to visit your family regularly even after your father's death, no longer appears at your door with his weekly offerings of help and companionship. The man who had once repaired your roof without being asked, who had carved toys for you as a child, who had always been available when your family needed assistance, now keeps his distance, as if the very air around your house carries poison. You understand his fear, but understanding does not ease the pain of abandonment. Even Anna, your closest friend since childhood, the girl who had shared your secrets and dreams, who had promised to stand by you through whatever life might bring, now avoids your home as if it were cursed ground. You had hoped that the bonds forged in youth might prove stronger than fear, that the love you had shared might overcome the terror of the plague. But you have learned that friendship, like so many other human connections, cannot survive the ultimate test of mortal danger. The isolation becomes complete when even the grave diggers, those hardy souls who make their living from death itself, begin to refuse their services to plague-stricken families. These men who had never shown fear in the face of disease or decay, who had handled the dead with professional detachment, now demand payment they know cannot be provided, and make excuses to avoid entering plague houses. The people whose job it is to deal with death have decided that some deaths are too dangerous to handle, leaving families to cope with the most difficult task of all without any assistance or guidance. As your mother's condition worsens, you find yourself entirely responsible for her care, a burden that feels overwhelming in its completeness. You have become nurse, companion, cook, and caretaker all at once, roles for which you have no training or preparation. Every decision about her comfort, every attempt to ease her suffering, every moment of her remaining life rests solely on your shoulders. The weight of this responsibility is crushing, made worse by the knowledge that you are probably making mistakes that someone with more experience might avoid. The practical challenges of caring for a plague victim without help reveal themselves in cruel detail. Your mother needs constant attention, but you must also somehow manage the household, prepare food, maintain the fire, and attend to all the other tasks that keep life functioning. There are no neighbors to ask for assistance, no friends to take turns watching over the sick, no community support system to share the burden of care. Every task, no matter how small, becomes a monumental challenge when you are the only person available to handle it. The nights are the worst, when your mother's fever spikes and she becomes delirious, calling out for people who are no longer alive, reliving conversations from decades past, sometimes recognizing you and sometimes staring at you as if you were a stranger. You sit beside her bed through these dark hours, holding her hand when she will let you, listening to her rambling words, trying to provide comfort even when she seems unaware of your presence. The loneliness during these vigils is absolute, a silence broken only by her labored breathing and the occasional sounds from the world outside that remind you how completely cut off you have become. Sleep becomes almost impossible as your mother's needs grow more constant and urgent. She requires water frequently but can barely swallow, needs to be turned regularly to prevent bed sores, but cries out in pain when moved, asks for food, but cannot keep anything down. You find yourself running on reserves of energy you did not know you possessed, drawing on wells of strength that seem to replenish themselves through sheer necessity. But even as your body finds ways to continue functioning, your spirit begins to crack under the relentless pressure of isolation and responsibility. The absence of medical care makes every decision feel like a matter of life and death. You have heard fragments of advice about treating plague victims, but much of it is contradictory, and none of it comes with any guarantee of effectiveness. Should you keep your mother warm or try to reduce her fever? Should you encourage her to eat or let her body rest? Should you drain the swellings that mark the plague or leave them alone? Every choice you make carries the weight of potentially helping or harming the person you love most in the world. As days pass without any contact from the outside world, you begin to lose track of time itself. The normal markers of daily life have disappeared, replaced by the irregular rhythms of illness and care. You measure time not by the ringing of church bells or the changing of the light, but by your mother's breathing, by the cycles of her fever, by the small changes in her condition that only you are there to observe. The world beyond your walls begins to feel like a distant memory, a place you once knew but can no longer quite recall. The mental toll of complete isolation begins to manifest in ways you had not anticipated. You find yourself talking aloud to fill the silence, carrying on conversations with your mother even when she cannot respond, speaking to the walls and furniture as if they were old friends. The boundary between internal thoughts and external speech becomes blurred as the need for human connection asserts itself in whatever way possible. Sometimes you catch yourself responding to questions no one has asked or laughing at jokes no one has told. The fear that you too will succumb to the plague adds another layer of anguish to your situation. Every headache, every moment of fatigue, every minor discomfort becomes a potential sign that the disease has claimed another victim. You watch your own body with the same careful attention you pay to your mother's, looking for the telltale signs that would mean your isolation is about to become even more complete. The knowledge that you might die alone, with no one to tend to you as you have tended to her, fills your quiet moments with a dread that is almost overwhelming. The house itself begins to feel like a tomb long before death actually arrives. The rooms where your family once gathered for meals and conversation now echo with emptiness. The kitchen where your mother prepared countless meals grows cold and unused. The front room where neighbors once visited becomes a space you avoid, too full of memories of better times. You find yourself living in an ever-shrinking circle of activity, confined to the bedroom where your mother lies and the few other spaces necessary for basic survival. When your mother finally draws her last breath on a gray morning in late autumn, the silence that follows is unlike anything you have ever experienced. It is not just the absence of her breathing, though that is profound enough, but the complete and total quiet of a world that has forgotten you exist. There is no one to share your grief, no one to help you understand what comes next, no one to witness the passing of a life that had meant everything to you and apparently nothing to anyone else. The reality of what you must do now settles upon you with the weight of an impossible burden. Your mother's body must be prepared for burial, but you have no knowledge of the proper procedures, no materials for the task, no guidance from those who traditionally handle such matters. The friends and neighbors who would normally help with these final rituals have abandoned you to face this ultimate challenge alone. The grave diggers who should take charge of the burial have made it clear they will not come near your house. You realize that you will have to dig your mother's grave yourself, using whatever tools you can find in whatever ground you can access. The thought of this task fills you with a despair so deep it threatens to overwhelm your ability to function. This woman who gave you life, who sacrificed everything for your welfare, who deserved to be honored and remembered by her entire community, will instead be buried by her child's inexperienced hands in a ceremony witnessed only by the wind and the clouds. The blanket you choose to wrap your mother's body becomes a symbol of everything that has been lost to the plague. It is the blanket she had woven herself during the winter when you were 10 years old, the one she had pulled over you during illnesses, the one that had covered 3 generations of your family during their times of need. Now it serves as a shroud, the only burial cloth available to honor a life that deserved so much more recognition and ceremony. As you carry your mother's body to the small patch of ground behind your house where you have managed to dig a shallow grave, you understand that you are not just burying her, but also burying the last connection to the world you once knew. With her death, you have become completely alone in a way that few people have ever experienced. The isolation that began with the plague's arrival is now complete, leaving you to face whatever time remains with no support, no comfort, and no hope of rescue from the outside world. The act of filling in the grave with your bare hands becomes a meditation on loss that extends far beyond the death of one beloved person. Each handful of earth represents another severed connection, another broken bond, another piece of the human network that once made life meaningful and bearable. You are not just burying your mother, but burying the entire structure of community and care that had previously given shape and purpose to your existence. As you stand beside the small mound of earth that marks your mother's final resting place, you realize that the plague has accomplished something more terrible than simply taking lives. It has destroyed the very fabric of human compassion and mutual support that makes survival possible in the face of life's greatest challenges. The isolation you have experienced is not just a byproduct of the disease, but its most devastating weapon, turning every person into an island surrounded by an ocean of fear and abandonment. Chapter 8. The church loses its voice. The mourning silence that settles over your plague-stricken town carries with it an absence so profound that it seems to alter the very nature of time itself. For as long as anyone can remember, the day has always begun with the deep, resonant tolling of the church bells, calling the faithful to morning prayers. These bronze voices have marked the rhythm of life in your community for generations, their familiar sound weaving through dreams to gently wake the sleeping, summoning workers to begin their daily labors, and reminding everyone that there is something larger than themselves watching over their small corner of the world. But now, as you lie in your bed, listening for the sound that has shaped every morning of your life, you hear only the whisper of wind through empty streets and the distant cry of ravens gathering in numbers that seem to grow larger each day. The bells that should be ringing out across the rooftops remain silent in their tower, not because the mechanism has failed or the ropes have broken, but because there is no one left with both the strength and the courage to climb the narrow stone steps and pull the heavy cords that would send their voice across the dying town. Father Benedict, the priest who had served your parish for more than 20 years, succumbed to the plague 3 days ago. His death marked not just the loss of an individual, but the collapse of an entire system of spiritual support that had sustained your community through every crisis it had ever faced. The man who had baptized your children, blessed your marriages, and comforted your dying had himself died alone in his small chamber behind the church, his final prayers heard only by the stone walls that had witnessed so many others before him. The younger priest who had recently arrived to assist Father Benedict lasted only 2 weeks after his superior's death. Father Marcus had been full of enthusiasm and determination when he first took on the responsibility of ministering to plague victims, believing that his youth and faith would protect him from the disease that was claiming so many lives. He visited the sealed houses daily, offering prayers through windows and doors, conducting funeral rites for the dead from a respectful distance, trying to maintain some semblance of the spiritual services that had always been available to those in need. But the plague makes no distinctions based on age or devotion, or the purity of one's intentions. Father Marcus developed the telltale fever on a Tuesday evening, and by Friday morning he was calling out in delirium from his sickbed, his words mixing Latin prayers with desperate pleas for relief from the pain that racked his young body. The few parishioners who remained healthy enough to care about such things could hear his voice through the thin walls of the rectory, a sound that seemed to echo with the death of hope itself. With the passing of both priests, your community finds itself in a spiritual wilderness unlike anything it has ever experienced. The church building still stands, its stone walls as solid as ever, its wooden pews arranged in neat rows as if waiting for congregants who will never return. But the building has become merely a shell, an empty vessel that once held the living presence of faith, but now contains only memories and dust and the lingering scent of incense from masses that will never be celebrated again. The absence of regular religious services creates a void in the lives of those who survive that goes far beyond the simple loss of weekly routines. For generations, the rhythm of your community's life has been structured around the church calendar, with its seasons of preparation and celebration, its feast days and periods of fasting, its ceremonies that marked the important transitions of birth, marriage, and death. Without priests to conduct these rituals, without the familiar cycle of masses and prayers, time itself seems to lose its meaning and direction. Some of the more devout members of your community attempt to maintain religious observances on their own, gathering in small groups to recite the prayers they remember from years of regular attendance. Old Margaret, who had served as the church's caretaker for decades, continues to enter the building each morning to light candles and dust the altar, performing these tasks with the same careful attention she had always shown. But her efforts feel like echoes of something that has already passed away, hollow gestures toward a system of belief that seems to have abandoned the very people who needed it most. The silence from the church tower affects everyone differently, but it affects everyone profoundly. Children who had learned to tell time by the regular ringing of the bells now wander through their days without the familiar markers that had given structure to their young lives. Adults find themselves pausing at moments when they expect to hear the bronze voices calling them to prayer, only to be reminded once again that this comfort has been taken away, along with so many others. The theological questions raised by the plague's assault on the church itself create a crisis of faith that spreads through the surviving population like a secondary infection. If God protects those who serve him faithfully, why have the priests died while some of the town's least religious residents remain healthy? If prayer and devotion offer any real protection from earthly suffering, why do the most pious families seem to suffer the same fate as everyone else? If the church is truly a sanctuary, why has it become as dangerous as any other gathering place? These questions, whispered in private conversations and pondered during the long, sleepless nights that have become so common, shake the foundation of beliefs that had seemed unquestionable just months before. Some people find their faith deepening in response to the crisis, interpreting the plague as a test that requires even greater devotion and submission to divine will. Others discover that their belief cannot withstand the reality of seemingly random suffering and they begin to drift away from practices and convictions that no longer provide comfort or explanation. The few attempts to hold religious services without ordained clergy reveal how dependent the community had become on the formal structures of the church. When Thomas the baker's brother tries to lead a prayer service in the town square, his words lack the authority and familiarity that come with proper training and ordination. The prayers he remembers are incomplete. The rituals he attempts to recreate feel awkward and uncertain. The people who gather to participate do so with a desperation that makes the inadequacy of the makeshift ceremony even more painful to witness. Even those who continue to believe find their relationship with the divine fundamentally altered by the plague's impact on their spiritual lives. Prayer becomes a more private and personal act, conducted in the solitude of individual homes rather than in the community setting that had traditionally given it power and meaning. The words feel different when spoken alone, carrying more weight, but also more uncertainty, as if the person praying is no longer sure that anyone is listening. The loss of confession as a regular practice weighs particularly heavily on the minds of those who had relied on this sacrament to maintain their spiritual well-being. Without a priest to hear their admissions of wrongdoing and grant absolution, many people find themselves carrying burdens of guilt and regret that seem to grow heavier with each passing day. The sins that once could be formally forgiven and released now accumulate like poison in the soul, adding psychological suffering to the physical dangers that already surround them. The absence of proper funeral rites becomes perhaps the most painful reminder of how completely the plague has disrupted the spiritual life of the community. Deaths that should be marked with ceremonies acknowledging the significance of lives lived and mourning shared collectively instead pass in silence and isolation. Bodies are buried without the prayers that should commend souls to God's care, without the rituals that should provide comfort to the grieving, without the community gathering that should affirm that each life had meaning and value. Some families attempt to conduct their own funeral services, reading from prayer books or reciting words they remember from other ceremonies they have attended. But these efforts only highlight how much has been lost, how inadequate individual efforts are to replace the complex system of spiritual support that had evolved over centuries. The words feel hollow when spoken by grieving relatives rather than by trained clergy, and the ceremonies lack the authority and completeness that had always made them sources of genuine comfort. The plague's assault on religious life extends beyond the immediate loss of clergy to affect the very buildings and objects that had served as focal points for community faith. The church itself, once a place of refuge and sanctuary, now stands as a potential source of contamination, its enclosed space and history of gatherings making it dangerous for the few survivors to enter. The holy water fonts remain empty, the communion chalices sit unused, the prayer books gather dust as reminders of practices that have become too risky to continue. Even the churchyard, traditionally a place of peace and remembrance, where generations of the community's dead rest in consecrated ground, becomes a source of fear rather than comfort. The recent graves, hastily dug and improperly marked, bear witness to deaths that occurred without proper spiritual preparation or ceremony. The living avoid walking among these graves, not out of respect for the dead, but out of fear that the very ground might carry the infection that claimed so many lives. The calendar of religious observances that had structured the year for your community continues to pass unmarked and uncelebrated. Feast days that should bring joy and community gathering instead arrive as painful reminders of what has been lost. Holy days that traditionally provided opportunities for reflection and spiritual renewal pass unnoticed except by those few individuals who maintain private observance in the isolation of their homes. Children who had been receiving religious instruction find their education abruptly terminated, leaving them without the spiritual foundation that previous generations had taken for granted. The catechism classes that should prepare them for confirmation cannot continue without clergy to guide them. The biblical stories and moral teachings that should shape their understanding of right and wrong must now be transmitted, if at all, by parents who may themselves be struggling with questions about faith and divine justice. The community's relationship with the broader church hierarchy becomes completely severed as communication with the outside world ceases entirely. No bishops arrive to assess the situation or provide guidance. No replacement priests are sent to fill the void left by the deaths of Father Benedict and Father Marcus. The local congregation finds itself completely cut off from the institutional support structure that had always provided continuity and authority in times of crisis. As weeks pass without any formal religious leadership, some members of the community begin to develop their own interpretations of the plague's meaning and significance. A few embrace apocalyptic thinking, convinced that the suffering they witness represents the end times described in Scripture, that the world itself is drawing to a close, and that earthly concerns no longer matter. Others turn to more primitive forms of spirituality, seeking signs and omens in natural phenomena, looking for divine messages in the flight patterns of birds or the shapes of clouds. The absence of structured religious life also creates space for superstition and folk beliefs to flourish in ways they had been suppressed by Orthodox church teaching. Old remedies and protective charms that had been passed down through generations, but discouraged by official doctrine, now emerge as people desperate for any form of spiritual protection grasp at whatever traditions they can remember. Herbs are burned not just for their supposed medical properties, but for their ability to ward off evil influences. Amulets and talismans appear as people seek tangible objects that might provide the protection that prayer alone seems unable to offer. Despite all the doubts and difficulties, despite the silence from the bell tower and the emptiness of the church building, despite the theological questions that seem to have no satisfying answers, you find yourself continuing to pray. Perhaps it is habit, the momentum of a lifetime of religious practice that continues even when its foundation has been shaken. Perhaps it is hope, the persistent belief that somewhere beyond the apparent chaos and suffering, there might still be a divine presence that cares about human welfare. Or perhaps it is simply desperation, the need to reach out towards something larger than yourself when you are confronted with circumstances that exceed your ability to understand or control. Your prayers have changed in character and content from what they were before the plague transformed your world. Where once you might have offered thanks for daily blessings and petitioned for minor improvements in your circumstances, now your words carry the weight of ultimate concerns. You pray for the souls of those who have died without proper spiritual attention. You pray for strength to endure whatever suffering may still lie ahead. You pray for forgiveness for whatever sins might have brought this catastrophe upon your community. And sometimes, in your most honest moments, you pray simply for the plague to end, for normalcy to return, for the bells to ring again across a town that remembers how to live rather than merely how to die. The words of these prayers feel different in the silence of your plague-emptied world. Without the familiar framework of formal worship services, without the community of other voices joining yours in familiar recitations, your individual prayers carry both more intimacy and more uncertainty. They become conversations with a divine presence that may or may not be listening, expressions of hope or fear or gratitude that echo in the emptiness of rooms where families once gathered and now only memories remain. As you kneel beside your bed in the gray light of another dawn without bells, as you whisper words that feel simultaneously essential and inadequate, you embody the spiritual condition of your entire community. Faith and doubt intermingle in ways that would have seemed impossible before the plague forced such terrible choices upon everyone. The certainties that once provided comfort have been replaced by questions that have no easy answers, but the human need for connection with something transcendent persists even when all traditional channels for that connection have been severed or destroyed.